is Z-Speed, and thanks for tuning back in. Today we're going to be replacing something that every 350Z owner will have to do sooner or later, and that is replace the window regulator and window motor. You're out having a great time driving around, getting your errands done, come home and you go to roll your window up and nothing happens, and that's what's happened to me here. I can't get my window up, so we'll go ahead and replace both of those units today. So if this is something you're interested in, stay tuned and we'll get right on it. So let's briefly go over some of the tools you might need. A small Phillips screwdriver, a regular sized, a 10mm socket and extension, and some of these panel removal tools here. These plastic ones are great. You can pick these up from Amazon for pretty cheap, and they really do cut down on all the scratches that you would normally get using a metal tool on all of your plastic parts inside your car. So try picking one of those up if you don't have one already. Now, their first little bolt slash Phillips screw is right underneath this tab right here, and they can be removed with either a Phillips screwdriver or a 10mm socket. And once you remove that, you can lift this whole little switch up, and there's two more screws that hold the panel on right there. And we've got one more right behind this little plastic piece, and we're going to pull that out, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute. And there's another Phillips screw slash 10mm bolt back there that we can take out. Once we get those out, then we're ready to actually just break free the whole panel from the door. We'll just have to go around the perimeter of the door and pop loose all the little plastic tabs, make sure they're all disconnected, and then we can lift the panel from the door. Once you get it loose, there's a couple of little things we'll have to disconnect, and I'll go over that in a minute, but we won't have to touch this tweeter box right here, so that will stay intact. So at this point, let's get started. Okay, I'm going to use a small 90-degree angle pick on these two little plastic coverings. Just be very careful if you do use a pick not to scratch up your plastic pieces. It's quite easy to do so, but this just makes it real easy to get this little tab out. And you can see it pop right out, and underneath there is a Phillips screw that we can pop out, and then we can release the switch. So that's what it looks like right there. And then up here behind the handle is another plastic covering. This one now is a little more difficult, and I almost actually scratched the plastic, so be careful. And I did eventually get to pop out without tearing it all up. So that's what this looks like. And now we can access the two Phillips screws, and I chose to use a magnetized Phillips screwdriver so I can hopefully keep track of these bolts. Now, if this one falls down to the door panel, it's not the end of the world, because once you remove the door panel, you'll be able to find it. But try to keep track of it here, and you can see this screw comes out real easy, no problems at all. Boom, there it goes right there. And then we're going to tack this one up here, so you can see this one's a little bit more difficult, but not bad, and I eventually get it out, and I am able to not drop it into the panel, but it was close. It hit the ground down here, so just be careful of that. Now you can take your little plastic panel removal tool and slip it down here into the switch and pop this straight up. Once you get this switch out of the door panel, you'll see these two Phillips screws that are holding the door panel on. And once you remove those, then we're pretty much ready to break the panel loose from the door. Okay, before we can get the door panel off, we do have to remove this power window switch. It's just got a couple electrical connections hooked up to it, and we have to depress a little tab. Now, you can use a very small flathead screwdriver to get in there, or you can use a small pick. I'm going to use that 90-degree pick again. Either one will work. is the hardest part is just depressing this little tab and then pulling the harness at the same time. You almost kind of like you need 3 hands to do this, but if you take your time, you can see I'm going to just put a little pressure on that switch, and at the same time I'm going to press down on the tab. So I'm kind of got like a pulling effect right here. You can see my left hand's pulling away while I'm pushing this tab, and finally it pops loose. And you're pushing right here on this tab. You push down on that and it should release. So take your time, definitely try not to damage these wires. That's the last thing you want is to damage these couplings, but it will take a little bit of effort to get them loose. And you can see I'm working at this one. This one's a little bit harder for me, but it eventually does come out as well. Now we're ready to take our plastic panel removal tool and just go along the edge the whole way down and just slowly pop this whole door panel loose. There's quite a few little tabs on the door, so take your time, make sure you've got them all loose, and once you do, this panel should slide right up and off of the door. So this is a pretty good design and it's pretty sturdy, so that's the good news. Now once you get the panel removed from the door, there are a couple cables that we have to release before we can get this panel out of the way here. Let me show you a little better angle here. And we have 2 cables, one controls the door and one controls the door lock. So we're going to remove these, and they just really simply pop out. So you can pop this loose right here. You can see I'm going to go real slow, and then you can remove this and this little ball right here, and that is the one that opens the door. And then we'll go very gently again to break this loose right here, and this is like an L configuration, and this actually controls the locking mechanism. So now that we've got these removed from the door, we're now able to get this panel out of our way. Now you're probably looking at my door panel at this point going, what is all this stuff, Z-Speed? I don't have all this stuff. And you're right, this is some aftermarket stereo equipment that I had Circuit City back when they were open. Remember when they were around before they got closed down? Circuit City put this in. It's a little cumbersome here. It's not quite the best job. I'm going to redo it myself, and I'll show you that later on. But right there is some sound deadening material. You probably won't have that either. But what we're going to be doing is working on this shield here, that this whole metal shield pops off this door, and once we remove that, we'll be able to get access to the regulator and the window motor. So you can see these 10 mil bolts all the way along the outer edge of this metal shield will have to be removed, and we'll go over that in a minute. And right here, these bolts right here hold the motor in, and then we've got the regulator screws. There's 4 of those. So here's one right here. Here's another one down below. There's a couple up top. So here's one, and then this little bolt right here, that is one, and right there's the other one with the washer around it, the shiny washer. Those hold the regulator in. So we're going to start working on that next, and we have to undo a couple clips as well. Now if your window motor dies while your window's up, you're going to have it a lot easier. You can remove this port, this little port right here, and these are just plastic coverings, and this right here, and you'll have access to the 3 bolts that hold the window on. You can loosen those up and slide your window right out and get that out of the way. But unfortunately mine's all the way down, and so there's a myth that you can uncover this little port right here, this one, and this one right here, and you'll have access to the window bolts, and that's simply not the case. Mine were further down, and I was unable to access those even with those ports uncovered. So we're going to have to remove this entire panel to get access to the motor, to the regulator, and to the window. And yes, we do have to take the window out of the door. So before I go any further, I'm going to go ahead and release the harness to the window motor itself. And it's just like the ones that we released on the window switch earlier. You just depress the tab, and then you're able to unclick it from the little electrical connection. It was pretty easy there. That was probably the easiest one I did all day. So now I'm going to go ahead and take the bolts out of the window motor. And remember, there's 3 of those. We're going to go ahead and remove all 3 of those. And then I'm going to go ahead and remove the 4 bolts that hold the window regulator in. Once we get all those released, and don't worry, this will all stay suspended inside the door itself. It's kind of a neat setup. But then we'll go around the outer edge and release all the 10mm bolts so we can then remove this whole metal panel and get access to everything. Now once you've got all the bolts removed from your window motor and your window regulator, you can go along the outside of this little shield and release all these 10mm bolts that hold it to the door frame. And you can see at the very bottom, I've still got a couple plastic tabs holding one of the electrical connections to this little metal shield, and we'll have to access those once we get this shield opened up. And you can see I'm using a little panel removal tool here to break this open. Now there's like some stickum and foam all on the outer edge, and that makes a watertight seal. And we'll have to be very careful when we go around the outside of the edge to break this loose. And it takes a little while. You don't want to rush it and bend this little metal shield here. So take your time, and once you get it going, it'll start to break free and you can loosen it from the door frame. Now that we've got the metal panel separated from the door frame, we can go ahead and grab a pair of needle nose pliers, come down here to the bottom where there's two little plastic zip ties, and we can click those and pop them right out of this little metal shield. Pretty easy to do, no problems with that. And that little harness goes to your window switch, in case you were wondering. And once you get that out of the little metal panel, you're now ready to work on the window motor harness, and we're going to detach it from this little piece of metal shield as well. Once you get that broken loose, then we can thread the electrical harness right on through this little shield here, and it's got a little plastic donut in there, and you can just slide it right out. Now that we've finally got everything freed up, we can kind of take a look at this panel. It's going to be a lot easier to put everything back in because we're going to attach the new regulator and motor directly to this metal panel and then attach it to the door, so it'll be a lot easier than what we've just been through. So now all we have to do is remove the window motor from the regulator, and we're going to need a large Phillips screwdriver to remove this motor. Now this motor has quite a bit of torque on these little screws, and if you don't use a large Phillips head screwdriver, you are most likely going to strip one of these screws, and I actually semi-stripped one of mine trying to get it out, so be very careful here. And once we get this broken loose, then we'll have access to the regulator itself, and I'm going to show you a little trick with a ratchet, and we can kind of try to get the window regulator to go up enough so we'll have access to the 3 10mm bolts that attach the window to the regulator. Now right now it's in a really bad position because it's all the way down, and I just don't have a lot of room to access these 3 10mm bolts, so I'm going to show them to you right now. Here's one, which really isn't that bad because you could use an open-end wrench or maybe even a ratchet. If you just lift up the whole regulator, you probably get that pretty easily. But once you go towards the front here, you can see we're not really working with a lot of room here, and at this point I would need an open-end wrench to get that. And there's one more bolt that I can't even show you because it's not visible while this window and regulator is in the door. So what you're going to do is grab this little attachment where the motor went, and then we're going to get a 3/8 inch ratchet, and we're going to pop it right in there. And I'm going to show you what it looks like right here, just like that. And you're going to just slowly crank it and get the window up just high enough so you can get better access to those 3 bolts. Once you get it up high enough, you should be able to get your ratchet or open-end wrench in there and get it out. And that's what I did, and I've already taken it out now. Sorry I didn't film that part and laid it down here. And we'll go over this in a little more detail in a minute. But yes, finally got that out, and that was a little bit tough, but try that trick and you may be able to get access to those bolts a little easier if you put your ratchet in there and kind of crank the window up manually. So now all we have left to do is remove the actual window from the door, and we're just going to tilt it up, and you can just go very slowly here, and I'm going to tilt the rear part up first, and it kind of just slides right out. It wasn't that difficult at all. So then we're pretty much done with getting all the hardware out of the door. Now it's time to reinstall all your new hardware onto your door panel, and I promise it's going to be a lot easier to do the installation than it was to take it off. Now right here I'm just checking my orientation of my new regulator onto this metal shield, and you can see that everything lines up pretty well here. But we still have to bolt our new window motor into the regulator before we can bolt it onto the metal shield, so I'm flipping it over here so I can get access to the regulator on the opposite side and bolt this motor in. Now sometimes your motor is not going to quite line up with the regulator, so at this point that's exactly what happens to me, and we're going to do the old 3/8 inch ratchet trick again, where I'm just going to pop the ratchet into the regulator and just twist it just a little bit, and it took me a couple times to get it just right to where I could reinstall the motor and it would line up perfectly with the regulator. But it did finally line up correctly, and I was able to snap it right in. So you'll feel it click in, and then now we're ready to bolt the motor onto the regulator. Okay, I just want you to pay special attention to these bolts as you're bolting the window motor back into the regulator. You want to torque these as hard as you can. Remember, when we took them off, they were really on there very tight, and we don't want this window motor to loosen up over time. So just take your time and make sure that you've got it equally torqued down all the way around, and obviously you don't want to strip the bolts, but just take your time and torque it down really hard. Now you can see now I flipped it back over, and I've actually got it upside down so it won't bolt back on this way, so it will only bolt on one way. That's the good news, so you can't get it wrong. Nothing will line up unless you get it in this position right here. Now that you got your motor torqued down to the regulator, it's time to loosely attach the regulator to the metal dust shield here. Don't forget your washers. Remember, we've got washers and nuts that hold this regulator to the dust shield, and I'm going to start from the bottom of the regulator, then I'll work my way to the motor assembly, and then we'll end up with the top of the regulator. So the reason we're just loosely hand tightening all this in right now is because we have quite a few nuts and bolts that are going to attach everything to this dust shield, and we just want to make sure that there's no cross threading going on. So if we go through and loosely hand tighten everything, we'll be assured that everything lines up before we start the torquing process. So I've got the bottom of this regulator loosely tightened on there, and now I'm going to move to the motor assembly. And remember, there's 3 Phillips screws that hold this motor assembly to the dust shield, and I might even recommend just a little bit of Loctite on these 3 Phillips screws, because they do take a lot of abuse when you're rolling the window up and down. Over time this thing could loosen up, so if you have any Loctite, think about that. But right now we're just loosely threading everything in to make sure that it lines up correctly, and then I'm going to end up at the very top of the regulator, and then we can begin the torque down process. Now we're ready to go ahead and torque down the regulator to the dust shield, and you can see I'm just loosely tightening it at first, and then once I get them all semi-snug, I'll go in an X pattern and make sure that they're torqued down. Remember, it is aluminum, so we don't have to go crazy, but make sure it's nice and tight so nothing starts to loosen up over time. Once you get those 4 torqued down, you can go ahead and torque the motor assembly down, and then we can thread the little electrical harness from the motor into the dust shield. Now the electrical harness has a little donut that clicks into the dust shield to keep it watertight, but what you don't want is this little electrical harness touching the regulator. You can see how close it is to the regulator. That might brush up against the window. So what I did was cut the zip tie right there, pull the harness through and make it a little tighter, then got a new zip tie and cinched it around the donut, and problem was solved. That's the only thing I had to do to modify anything. And then you're going to be very careful to get the regulator and slip it around the door frame here. That was a little tricky, but not too bad. And you can see it took me a little second, and then boom, it slipped by, and now we've got it into the door. So we're almost home free. Okay, once you get this dust shield lined up with all these holes, you can go ahead and grab a couple 10mm bolts and loosely thread them in here so you don't have to keep hanging on to this dust shield. And once you get that done, you just go around the perimeter and hand tighten all of your 10mm bolts into the door. And what you want to do is make sure that they're not cross-threading, because it would be quite easy to do that. So take your time and hand thread all your bolts before we do any tightening of the dust shield to the door frame. Now that your dust shield's all bolted down, I'm going to go ahead and grab the window switch and attach it to the harness and just make sure that this window motor works correctly before I go any further. I don't want to get it all together and then test it. So at this point, yes, it works great. I can hear it moving around in there, up and down. Checked it several times. Everything checked out perfect. So now all we have to do is put the window in and line that up. So at this point, I've lowered the regulator down to the area where we can access these bolt holes right here, and I've removed the coverings. We talked about this earlier. This is in the window up position for the glass being bolted into the regulator. And so you just take your time and thread those bolts in. Be careful not to drop them in the door. That would be a big problem if you did at this point. And once you get these all lined up and loosely tightened, we have to straighten the window and get it to seal correctly, because I actually thought I had it right and ended up going back in, loosening them and realigning, because I had a little bit of a gap and it was kind of clapping the top of my plastic trim up here. And I'll show you what I'm talking about. Right here, you can see that it's not very tight right here. So I'm gonna have to pull this back this way just to get a better seal. So it's not that hard. You may have to try it a couple times before you get everything perfectly lined up. But you can see here, it's just not quite lined up, and then you can't hear it, but it's kind of clapping against the top of that plastic trim. So I've actually readjusted it at this point, and now I've got to the point where it's not catching on the top of the door frame right here. So that's nice. And I'm just double checking, closing and opening the door until I got it just right. And so at this point, I'm pretty happy with that. And you can see that the seam line is a lot better than it was previously. So it may take a while, don't rush it. It took me several attempts to get everything just the way I wanted it. But once you do get it right, you can go ahead and tighten these bolts down, and that'll secure the window to the regulator. And we just don't want to over tighten these. We want them nice and snug, but it is glass, and so we don't want to crack the window, obviously. So make sure it's nice and snug, and that should be enough. Okay, now it's time to get inside the car, and we're going to reset this automatic window button. And the first thing you're going to need to do is just turn on your accessory mode in your ignition, and just have that on so that the power window actually works. And after that, we're going to grab our power window switch and hook it up to the harness, and that's all it takes. And we're going to go ahead and go through the reset procedure now. But if you don't do it, I'm going to show you what will probably end up happening to your window real quick. So what usually happens is it'll roll down just fine, and then when you go to roll your window back up, it goes all the way to the top and bounces back down to varying degrees. And this is a safety mechanism that Nissan put in to keep from pinching someone's fingers or hand. So right now this window does not know when it's completely closed, and we're gonna have to train it to the new closed position. So every time I roll it up, you can see it thinks that it's hitting someone's hand, and the safety mechanism makes it roll right back down. So that's why we're gonna have to reset the switch. We're gonna start this procedure off with the window all the way up. You don't wanna use the auto up button. You wanna hold the button till it's completely closed, and then we're gonna go over here. We're gonna remove this little vinyl covering that's over the reset button on the motor, and we're gonna press it, and here it is right here. It's right above the window switch harness down there. You can see the window switch harness. It's right above that. So you can see it's just a nice little plastic coated button, and we're gonna press that in while we do the next step. So while you're holding the motor reset button, go ahead and open the window all the way down. Keep your finger depressed on it till it's all the way open. Then you can let both of the buttons go at the same time. And all we have to do now is roll the window all the way up again. So we want to hold the button until it's completely closed. Keep it in the up position. We're done. And now we're going to grab this little cable with a ball on the end and open the door, and your reset procedure is all complete. Now at this point, you want to go ahead and turn your ignition off before you disconnect this power window switch. If you leave it on, the window may have to be reset again. That's the last thing you want. So go ahead and turn the ignition off, remove that switch so we can put the panel back on. And I'm also going ahead and I'm going to cover these little holes that we were working with earlier to fasten the window to the regulator, and basically just get a little bit of glue, something light, nothing real heavy, and put it around that, and you can stick it right over and it'll adhere. Those are just to keep the dust out of the cabin. If you're wondering about my crossovers, you can see I've repositioned those. I just took one little hole I had to drill into the door to place them right there, and I cleaned up the wiring. You can see it's a pretty good spot right there. So if you have any crossovers in your 350Z, this is a great spot, and it also allows you to put the door coverings over this and not bump anything. So good spot for your crossover if you have those. So all you have to do now is replace your door panels and you are all ready to go. So I hope this video helped you out. I thought I'd get a good picture of the sunset as it was setting in the southeast. And if this video helped you out, please consider subscribing, give me a thumbs up, and stay tuned. In 2020, we've got up-rev tuning. I just can't wait for that. It's going to be an awesome video. And until then, just keep on repairing.